What's up, guys? I'm Chad Barnes, and welcome to the channel. Here, it's all about real car talk, from simple fixes to smart driving tips and keeping your ride in top shape. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button and make sure you watch all the way through. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Let's get to
begin with, it will not be harmful to briefly outline the history of the evolution of Soviet car audio equipment. To understand what was happening in general and in what years. In the USSR, car radios and tape recorders were produced by about 24 enterprises scattered in different republics. Kharkov radio plant Proton, Yerevan plant Garny, Vilnius instrument making plant Vilma, etc. However, the leading manufacturers of this segment of consumer goods, maintaining more or less regular updates of model lines and supplying products, including to car assembly lines, were primarily Murom radio plant in the Vladimir region, Sarapol plant in Udmurtia, Zagorsky plant Zvezda in the Moscow region, and Grodno plant in Belarus. The Soviet industry has always lagged behind the Western industry in this area, although to varying degrees. For example, if we talk about the first automobile radio receiver, we can say, went nose to nose. In the USA it appeared in 1930. In Europe in 1932, and in the USSR in 1936. Surprisingly, in the 50s and 60s in the USSR there were even unsuccessful attempts to experiment with vinyl record players for cars. Again at about the same time as the Western manufacturers, although very conventionally. With the onset of the era of compact cassettes, we again lagged behind. The first Soviet car stereo appeared in 1975, about 5 to 6 years after the bourgeois. But the bourgeois went further behind, and very noticeably. In their car stereos appeared auto reverse, track search, a lot of service functions for convenience. Radio receivers got LCD displays and accompanying digital tuning, auto search and station memory. Our stereos, even changing slightly from model to model, remained extremely primitive, and receivers, the simplest, with manual tuning. By the end of the 80s began to show attempts to catch up somehow. Some observation of the evolution of domestic tape recorders gives the impression that a new generation of young engineers came to the radio factories and brought fresh solutions to the musty world of the old-timers. However, they were not destined to turn around and realize new ideas. In '91 the union collapsed, and our engineers went with checked bags. Nevertheless, it is curious to take a look at the attempts to catch fleeing technologies that have long been history. So here we go. Car radio receiver toner RP-303A. 1987 This monophonic radio receiver was produced by Molodechno radio plant Sputnik in the Belarusian SSR, and it was recommended for VAZ 2105-07 and 2108. The model was interesting first of all because of the built-in digital clock, which, in addition, could automatically turn on the radio at the program time, apparently, to wake up the driver sleeping in the car. Today it may sound like nonsense, but in 1987 in the USSR a clock radio was an incredible breakthrough and cool. Digital indication as an element of industrial design in the 80s was at the peak of fashion and was considered a natural fetish. And the integration of devices, clocks built into car receivers, delighted car enthusiasts because at that time functional integration was not so common in household appliances. To understand this situation, in the 80s for a dozen models of domestic car radios there were only a couple or 3 tape recorders, combining the radio and cassette player. That is, even such a banal tandem continued to be rare and scarce, what to speak of a receiver with a whole electronic clock. The ranges in toner RP-303A were switched, pseudo-sensor, that's what it was called then and considered advanced. In other words, VHF, CB and VHF were switched by successive pressing of one button without fixation, in a circle. Another interesting advantage that distinguishes RP-303A from other receivers and tape recorders of the same period is different color schemes. The radio was offered in 2 panel colors, black and silver, which, again, other models could not boast of. The watch display is realized on 4 microscopic LED digital indicators ALS314A. Really microscopic, not exaggerating. The height of the red lighted digit in the indicator is 2.5 mm. To see the time in motion on the screen of the clock without taking off from driving the car, the driver of the car had to have an eagle's visual acuity. Funny by modern standards and the tuning scale in the receiver, but it is no longer, unlike the clock display, was not something unusual for Soviet car stereos of those years. Although for the world car audio industry as a whole such a solution is unusual and atypical because the scale was a special vacuum, luminescent indicator. For many years all over the world, not excluding the USSR, radio receivers were produced with a classical mechanical tuning scale, where an arrow indicating the frequency was crawling along the digitized plate on a string. However, by the end of the 80s, foreign manufacturers of car audio began to systematically move to digital tuning and digital frequency indication, which gave a perfectly clear retention of the station and memory cell. The semiconductor industry of the USSR did not produce frequency synthesizer chips for receivers, but the years went by and the functionality and design of tape recorders had to be refreshed somehow. That's why many of our radio factories at that time began to use an intermediate variant. Tuning of receivers remained analog, with the help of the usual multi-tone knob, but the scale was made like electronic. But not digital, but simply linear, on the greenish-blue indicator of that screen synchronously with the rotation of the tuning knob moved to the right-left segmented luminous strip. And this indicator was not even LED, but vacuum luminescent, that is in full measure warm lamp, without irony. For the above-mentioned reasons, such receivers were not made abroad, but in our country such receivers were very common at the turn of the 80s and 90s. However, even though these indicators were not universal, but were developed specifically for Soviet car audio, from the point of view of user-friendliness the solution was not very good. Yes, it was slightly prettier than the mechanical scale and supposedly resembled a display. But the electronic scale of that display was marked in parrots, not in megahertz, but in impersonal and meaningless numbers from 1 to 10, and it was impossible to understand clearly what frequency you were on at the moment, only approximately. Plus the tuning remained purely analog and was still capable of floating away over time from the vibration of the car and temperature changes in the cabin. Car Radio Receiver Cruise 203. 1988 The monophonic radio receiver Cruise 203, produced by the Leningrad plant, Russia, was the first Soviet car radio receiver with a full-fledged frequency synthesizer, full-fledged digital display, full-fledged frequency memory and in addition, with a huge number of reception ranges. The design of Cruise is specific. It partly traces the style of industrial equipment, but in its time it harmonized well with the interior of the early 8, with a low torpedo and a lot of indicator lights on the dashboard, grouped into a single array. The sticker on the receiver case proudly reads, with microcomputer control and frequency synthesizer. Actually, at that time any controller with the simplest executable program embedded in it was called microcomputer, that was the custom. But nevertheless we must admit, before the Cruise, the Soviet industry had not produced receivers with electronic tuning, auto search, and 6 memory cells for selected radio stations. Actually, the spread of radio receivers with digital tuning and station memory in our country was constrained not only by the aforementioned lack of special synthesizer chips, but also by the very modest number of broadcasting radio stations. On the long, medium and ultra-shortwave bands, by and large, worked a few programs of all-union radio because the purpose of the system Gostella radio was to increase the density of coverage of broadcasting, but not its diversity. And until 1990, after which on VHF 65 to 74 MHz, like mushrooms after the rain, began to appear numerous commercial music radio stations. Manual tuning in radio receivers was quite enough, because the bands were not full, as now crowded FM 87 to 108 MHz. Drivers listened to usually the same station without having to retune to a different frequency when commercials came on, as we do today. Seeing as there are no commercials, by the way, stereo reception was not too necessary either. Rare VHF stations broadcast in stereo. In general, the multiband capability of the Cruise is a separate story. There are a lot of reception ranges in it by domestic standards and extremely many by foreign standards, where only ultra-short and medium waves have long since taken root. Shortwave ranges from foreign-made car receivers by the 80s have already disappeared completely, they simply ceased to be in demand among car owners against the background of saturated stations' FM sites. Actually, in the Soviet car audio equipment they were rare and limited. But in Cruise there were as many as 7 ranges, 4 of which were shortwave. Short waves with their specificity of ionospheric propagation for thousands and tens of thousands of kilometers from the radio station. Allowed to receive radio in the car regardless of distance from cities and repeaters, which was quite important given the length and sparsely populated territory of the USSR. Cruise 203 reception ranges, VHF, 65 to 74 MHz. Long wave DV, 0.144 to 0.297 MHz. Medium wave CB, 0.512 to 1.647 MHz. Shortwave, subband KV, 5.850 to 6.300 MHz. KV, 7,000 to 7,400 MHz. KV, 9,450 to 9,900 MHz. KV, 11,600 to 12,100 MHz. And, of course, in all this beauty, you cannot do without a spoonful of tar. The digital display of Cruise was based on the same LED indicators ALS314A as the clock in toner RP303A, the number of 4 and with digits 2.5 mm high. To observe which it was necessary, squinting, to look carefully into the narrow strip of the screen, in addition sharply faded in the sun due to the initially extremely low brightness. Car stereo Ural RM 292. 1991, and, finally, the pearl of that era, car stereo Ural RM 292, practically the last own development of Staropolsky radio plant. From the essential, after which he went to unpretentious cloning of various Asian consumer goods by technologies of screwdriver assembly. Ural RM 292 is the first and only Soviet car stereo with a full-fledged LCD display. Its receiver is digitally tuned with frequency synthesizer, auto search and memory for 6 stations. The display is equipped with amber yellow backlighting, and the keys are also illuminated, though not all of them. The cassette player has auto reverse and a switch for chrome tape. The design of the front panel is quite in the spirit of similar foreign models. Ergonomics is reasonable, there is nothing to get seriously upset about. The inscriptions on the face inform about the microcomputer control, as well as about the presence of an imported LPM, tape pulling mechanism. Japanese Tanishin and Korean Samsung have been encountered. The year of announcement of Ural PM 292 is 1991, and although it cannot be formally referred to the Soviet era, this tape recorder is still a Soviet product because it was developed under the USSR. Our technological lag is, alas, evident here, but with the correction for the conditions it is actually generally explainable. Yes, on Mercedes-Benz, for example, the first stereo with LCD display, produced by MB-friendly brand Becker, appeared 10 years earlier. In 1981, on cars in the 126th body. But where is the world leader of automobile industry Mercedes in prosperous Germany, and where is Staropol radio plant named after Orjanakidze in the USSR that was collapsing before our eyes? Unfortunately, this copy of Ural PM 292 did not escape the characteristic problem inherent in many Soviet-made liquid crystal displays. Over the years they leaked. Segments on the screens became blurred, merged and simply went out. Foreign electronics manufacturers, in fact, also faced this problem. But they survived the difficulties of growth 5 to 7 years earlier than we did. In conclusion, the late Soviet era produced some truly unique car stereos that reflect the ingenuity and creativity of the time. From the unconventional designs to the innovative features, these devices not only served as a means of entertainment but also as a symbol of a rapidly changing society. As we look back on these remarkable pieces of technology, we gain a deeper appreciation for the cultural context in which they were created. The legacy of these unusual car stereos continues to resonate, reminding us of a time when music and innovation intertwined in unexpected ways. Thank you for joining us on this nostalgic journey through the last sob of Soviet electronics.